It's a pleasure to be here, and also it's a pleasure to introduce, my mentor, PLO Lumumba. It's actually the first time meeting PLO, but I've known him for such a long time because I always watch his videos, and we would pick him up from the airport, and he's here with us. I'll do a very brief introduction because I know that if I read the whole bio, we're going to be here for a while. So I'll make it very brief as possible. So we are here to be inspired to action by one of Africa's greatest minds. He's a Pan-Africanist, he's an activist, he's a public lawyer, prolific lawyer, and he's traveled all across the continent. He's a mentor to many of us. He's a brother, in the African culture. When it's a brother, meaning really it comes from our heart. He's really been very inspirational to us, especially the youth and the continent overall. We are very fortunate to have him in Cincinnati, and I know that today's meeting you're gonna learn so much from him. So without further ado, I would like to really welcome Professor PLO Lumumba. He's gonna walk down, and I'm gonna just get out of this stage, and he's gonna walk here and take it over from here. So thanks so much, James. And Prof. PLO is gonna come up here in a few minutes. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Prince, and thank you very much, my brethren in this part of the world, in Cincinnati specifically. And I must say how glad I am to be invited to share my thoughts with you. I know that your mandate is about foreign policy, but I'm quite certain that in order to appreciate foreign policy, it is critical that we understand Africa, and also to understand that Africa cannot be an island, and that therefore it is necessary that she interacts with other parts of the world, whether it's the United States of America, Europe, or Asia. But in order to engage in that conversation, it is also important at the very outset that there is the tendency to look at Africa as if Africa were a homogeneous whole, which I think is not the case. And if one wants to deal with Africa from that perspective, one will get it wrong. Africa is diverse. Africa is heterogeneous. And while it is romantic to say this is how we ought to deal with Africa, if one does not understand the nuances which inform African dynamics, one will get it wrong. And that diversity is informed by certain realities. The reality is that in this day and age, Africa still labors under domination in quite a number of areas, particularly in the arena of foreign policy. So that if you went to West Africa, for example, and engaged with the former colonies of France, the activities of quite a number of those nations are still dictated to by the French administration. One need only look at what has happened in the recent past in Chad or in Mali, or what is happening currently in Burkina Faso, and the military presence of the French to appreciate how pervasive and sometimes pernicious the presence of France is in that part of the world. So that even as we talk about foreign policy from a regional perspective, and quite a number of you will know that Africa has been grouping for a long time under the regional bodies. The West African countries will be grouped under the Economic Community of West African States, which incorporate countries that were colonized by France. You also have Guinea-Bissau, which was colonized by the Portuguese, and Cape Verde. You have Sierra Leone, you have Liberia, you have Nigeria, you have Ghana. So that all these things do come into play when we begin to talk about foreign policy. The other area that you want to be alive to is the Maghreb, which would include in this regard Morocco, Tunisia, and Egypt. And that part of the world is a little bit eclectic in the manner in which it relates to Africa. When it suits them, then they are in the Arab world. When it suits them, they are in the African world. And I think that that kind of duplicity also does have an impact on how one relates to those countries that I've just mentioned. And of course, when you come to the Central African region, which also has countries that were formerly colonized by France, and you come to a large country, I believe the largest country in Africa now, the Democratic Republic of Congo, the presence there of the Belgian administration, albeit in a very subterranean way, does also impact the foreign policy. And when you go down to Southern Africa, you'd also find that there are groupings under the SADC, the South African Development Countries, and that also has its own problems. You have large countries such as Angola, Mozambique, and of course South Africa, which is the economic anchor down there. And you go to Namibia, and of course you go to Zambia and others. And in the East African region, you also have Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Rwanda, and Burundi, and of course South Sudan, and the Democratic Republic of Congo has made an application to join the East African community. And all these things cannot be ignored when we talk about foreign policy and we talk about redefining Africa. One of the things that we ought to appreciate is that Africa, or African countries in their totality, the differences notwithstanding, have always understood and appreciated that in order to play an important role in dealing with the world, there is need for African countries to collaborate. And this collaboration is informed by the fact that as independent units, as standalone countries, they are too weak to negotiate. And we have seen, if you allow me to delve into a little history, as early as the 1960s, the clarion call of the leaders then was that Africa would only be able to articulate her foreign policy in an effective manner if they did so as Africa. And subsequent to the activities in the 1960, when the world was in the midst of the Cold War, of course, in those early days, some countries gravitated toward the West, some gravitated toward the Soviet Union as it was then constituted. But even in those early days, one saw certain economic activities that were designed to undermine corporate Africa's approach to our issues. It is in that context that I look at the early efforts under what was then described as the Lomé Convention in 1975, which brought together European and the Caribbean nations and African nations under an economic arena. That, of course, was followed very quickly by the Cotonou Agreement, which also tried to ensure that African countries largely remained under the tutelage of foreign powers. And some may not agree with me, but many of these post-independent arrangements, such as the groupings where you have former French colonies working under the guidance of France, or the Commonwealth, which works under the guidance of the United Kingdom. These bodies have what one must describe for what they are. They are a very surreptitious attempt by the former colonizers to continue to dominate the foreign policy of African countries. And many African countries, because they are weak, tend to be manipulable and are indeed manipulated to the detriment of their citizens. And to continue on the trajectory that I started in terms of understanding these things in a historical context, in 1980, under the Lagos Plan of Action, African countries took the view, which was the correct view, that if Africa was to play a critical role in the world, then Africa must do a number of things, one of which that intra-African trade must be enhanced. And the Lagos Plan of Action in 1980 was quite clear that Africa must now move as one whole. And during that period, is very interesting that Africa was laboring under major economic difficulties. And many of you will remember the structural adjustment programs, which required, among other things, that many African countries were to implement the economic prescriptions of the Bretton Woods institutions, the International Monetary Fund. And the effect of those prescriptions, which were one-size-fits-all prescriptions, is that many jobs were lost, many institutions in which government had interest were also privatized, and the process of privatization, while it has its own merits, also has its weaknesses, particularly when you are dealing with weak economies. I was just looking yesterday, just to give you an example how weak African economies are. I was looking at the gross domestic product of the state of Minnesota, the state of Minnesota, which has a population of no less than 6 million, and its GDP last year was about $358 billion. That is larger than the economies of Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Rwanda, Burundi, Democratic Republic of Congo, and South Sudan combined. And I'm talking about a population of nearly 400 million. And that is one state of the United States of America. And therefore, when one talks about foreign policy, one must understand it from the perspective that foreign policy is defined by economic factors. And African countries, therefore, tend to be weak in this regard, even when we talk about the regional organizations. Of course, it ought to be realized that it is not as if African countries have never known that their weakness is being divided into little countries with fundamentally non-viable economies. This realization has always been there. And in the recent past, you've seen that at a continental level, particularly when there was transition from the Organization of African Unity to the African Union in the 2000s, a number of initiatives have been put in place in order to reboot African economies, with the hope that this would also inform better interaction at the foreign policy level. This is how one understands the new Partnership for Economic Development, NEPAD. This is how we came about in the year 2013 with Africa Agenda 2063, which is a continental initiative whose raison d'etre is to ensure that by the year 2063, African economies have grown to a level where the lives of the people would be middle income, of course, as defined by the World Bank and other international institutions. And Africa Agenda 2063 is now nearly 10 years old. And what has happened, of course, is the realization that a mere declaration that you are going to have this kind of grand agenda is a hollow rhetoric unless it is undergirded by clear economic activities which are measurable, which are time-bound. And in the month of January this year, we saw the coming into force of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. And that, I think, is very important. The Africa Continental Free Trade Area, which is now headquartered in Accra, Ghana, has one clear agenda. One, that Africa must trade with herself. If you look at the levels of trade continentally, In Europe, I think intra-European trade is anything between 70%. The United States of America is anything between, rather Northern America, what used to be NAFTA, could possibly be in the neighborhood of 55 to 65%. If you go to Asia now, it is anything between 50 and 55%. If you come to Africa, it is as low as 20%. And when you are talking about intra-African trade, it then tells you that the 1.5 billion of us are not trading. And one sees this in quite a number of very interesting areas. I was talking to a gentleman who is involved in cage farming in my rural village in Nyanza, and he's importing food, fish food from Brazil, which means, therefore, that when you are doing that, the cost of fish in Kenya or in Uganda or in Tanzania is still more expensive than fish imported from China. And these are issues that cannot be ignored. And it is on the basis of that evidence that we must now ask ourselves the fundamental question: how is Africa going to relate to the world in the 21st century? How is Africa going to define her agenda in the 21st century in a manner that is going to be beneficial to our people? Because the question is, what is indeed the purpose of having a clearly defined foreign policy? I now hear many African countries saying that our foreign policy is going to be economy-led, which in my understanding means that when Africa is relating to the rest of the world, she is doing so in a manner that is going to help reboot our economy, which means that if you relate with the rest of the world in a manner that you define clearly, it is going to have a positive impact on your economy. And if it has a positive impact on your economy, it is going to ensure that your agriculture is that much improved. It is going to ensure that your health sector is improved. It is going to ensure that your natural resources are utilized effectively. It is going to ensure that your human resources are deployed in an effective manner. It is going to ensure that the totality of the interactions are going to facilitate your entire agenda so that the quality of the people's lives are improved. But in this regard, it must never be forgotten that international interactions is also dictated to largely by certain political realities. And one sees in Africa that there is a new latter-day scramble for Africa. You only have to see or visit the port of Djibouti and see the presence of the military bases there of the United States of America, of Japan, of China, and much more recently you see the erection of military bases in countries such as the Central African Republic by Russia and in Sudan. It means that in matters of foreign relationship, really the rule is still the law of the jungle, survival of the fittest and the dying of the least suitable. And when I talk about survival of the fittest, to be fit in matters international, you've got to be militarily powerful. And that defines why, therefore, the United States of America remains the hegemon in the world in terms of dictating to African countries what it is they must do, even when such dictation is subtle. Europe, of course, also has our own agenda. First, under the European Union, the 27 countries operate under that particular arrangement, and you see that there is something that can actually be referred to as a Brussels government, which wants to interact with Africa as a Brussels government. You also want to see what is happening in the Soviet Union. You've seen that what is happening in Japan and in China. And it has never been lost on me. And this is something that happens annually. You see African leaders being invited for a conference in Moscow between Russia and Africa, which I think is ill-informed. You find 54 African countries invited to Moscow. And Moscow has an arrangement with what they say is an African arrangement. When these individuals go back to Africa, to their individual countries, then they no longer relate with the Soviet Union as one Africa, but they do so as individual sovereign states. And in that very same year, and I'm using the year without giving which year, I'm just talking about year. In that same year, you will find African leaders once again invited to Beijing. And they go to Beijing, and the president of China tells them, we have given Africa $60 billion. When you look at $60 billion and you talk about Africa, it sounds like it's quite some money. That is the annual GDP of the Republic of Kenya. But look at the 55 countries that you are dealing with. You are then saying that each one of the countries notionally will receive 1 billion, which is a pittance, is a drop in the ocean. And in the same year, they are once again invited to Tokyo. And in the same year, they are invited to India. So that you see an Africa that is always manipulated. You see an Africa that is always at the beck and call of other powers. You see an Africa whose economic agenda is externally defined. And you see, therefore, an Africa which is at the mercy of foreign powers. And beyond lamenting about it, what are we to do? What we are to do is to ensure that going forward, Africa recognizes that our long-term health and our long-term survival not only requires, but demands that she is a lot more organized. During this period of COVID, for example, there is not a single African country whose economy has not contracted. And the net effect is that with the contraction of the economies, there are accompanying job losses, there are weaker environments which are susceptible to the vagaries, not only of the weather and other things, but there are things that are happening which therefore undermine African growth. And as I said a little earlier, delays the realization of the fuller dividends of the promises that the continent has made to herself under Africa Agenda 2063, and therefore the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. Which begs the question, therefore, what do we do as a continent in order to ensure that we realize what is in the best interest of our countries? How do we define our foreign policy, knowing as we do that each country or each region acts in her best interest? I give this example ad nauseum, that 2 years ago, I watched the meeting of the Chinese Communist Party. And as they were talking and their discussions were subtitled in English, they were thinking about how they will deal with the continent of Africa 100 years thence. In other words, China is asking herself the fundamental question: how are we going to interact with African economies 100 years from today? And when they ask those fundamental questions, what they are doing is that their agenda is designed to do that which is in the best interest of China. And how do they do it? Do they do it continentally? No. They may tell Africa, we are going to build you the headquarters of the African Union. They may tell Africa that we are going to build for you the headquarters of your Center for Disease Control. But when they are negotiating with Africa on matters fundamental, they no longer want to negotiate with Africa as Africa. They now want to deal bilaterally. They'll come to South Sudan and deal with the Juba administration. They'll go to Central African Republic and deal with the Central African administration. They'll go to Nairobi and deal with the Kenyan administration. They'll go to the Democratic Republic of Congo and deal with the Kinshasa administration. They'll go to Burkina Faso and deal with the Ouagadougou government. The net effect is that the whole idea of negotiating with foreign powers as a united Africa is then undermined by this bilateralism, which is a tactic and a strategy at once to ensure that Africa always interacts at her weakest point. And this has great impact at all levels. It has the impact economically, it has the impact socially, and it also has impact in other areas to the detriment of Africa. I'll give you a recent example. The East African community takes the view that in order to interact with matters of trade with the United States of America, East Africa, under the East African community, is going to negotiate with the United States of America as East Africa. And then if there are peculiarities or specificities which are unique to Kenya or unique to Uganda or unique to Tanzania or unique to Burundi or unique to Rwanda or unique to Southern Sudan, they are going to be discussed in the context of an African negotiation. What does the government of the United States of America do? They go to Kenya and they circumnavigate the East African agreement and instead enter into bilateral arrangements with Kenya, promising Kenya these are going to be the advantages. When they do that, then they undermine trust. And Tanzania then says, what is the significance of remaining in this community, in this economic bloc, if we can be ignored, if we can be manipulated? We see that in West Africa, when the West African countries take the view that in order to undergird our economies and to ensure that currency fluctuations do not occur, we as members of ECOWAS are going to have a currency called ECO. And that therefore we are going to move in the direction of having this particular currency to protect our economies and to ensure that we move in the direction of guaranteeing movement of goods and movement of labor. What does France do? France goes to La Côte d'Ivoire and they persuade La Côte d'Ivoire and other former French colonies to create an ECO which is still pegged to the Paris Central Bank. These are things that cannot be ignored. The other thing that we cannot ignore is the state of stability in Africa. Permit me and grant me this latitude to walk you across the continent of Africa as I speak, if only to help me in a few minutes to elaborate what I think is danger confronting the African governments from a foreign policy perspective. Look at Africa today. Look at the number of conflicts that are sometimes manufactured externally, and if not externally manufactured, are perpetuated by external powers. The conflict in Cameroon, pitting the Ambazonians and the government in Yaoundé. When there is conflict in Cameroon, it undermines the economic agenda of that country. Look at the entire Sahelian region and see the conflicts that are taking place there. If it is not in Chad, it is in Mali. If it is not in Mali, it's in Burkina Faso. If you go to Sudan, you find the instability in the Nuba Mountains, in Bahr el Ghazal, in Western Nile. If you go to South Sudan, we now have nearly 4.5 million people who are displaced. If you go to Ethiopia, you find the fratricidal war that is now taking place involving the Addis Ababa government and the Mekele administration, pitting the Tigray and the Amhara and go to Mozambique now, in northern part of Mozambique, the instability in Mogadishu, see what is happening in Central African Republic. And all these things, as I've said, may have a genesis out of little conflicts in the continent, but they are exacerbated by machinations which are at once choreographed and coordinated diabolically from forces outside of the continent of Africa. And it is not lost on me, for example, that the year 2020 was what was described as the year of silencing the guns for purposes of creating an environment that is suitable for economic development. You and me know that no guns were silenced, and during this year, we actually have a flare-up of quite a number of conflicts which has seen the presence of newer powers in the continent, both militarily and otherwise. So that is the Africa that we are talking about. So how must and how should Africa define her foreign policy? This is easier said than done, but I hold the view that if Africa is going to have a pride of place in the scheme of things, Africa must begin to dissolve and to de-emphasize. African countries must begin to dissolve and to de-emphasize their sovereignties. I was reading a book which is written by Senegal's Anta Cheikh Diop, in which Anta Cheikh Diop says that there is a case for a federated Africa. And he's not naive when he says this. He recognizes that in order for Africa to make sense in the world, her approaches should be coordinated. And going forward, I think that the African Union must, in the nature of things, begin to reboot her agenda. The beauty of the African situation is that we have been able to diagnose our problems. And this has been seen in a number of areas. If you go to the number of protocols that we have seen in the recent past, we saw the Yamoussoukro protocol that dealt with air transport in Africa. We saw the Maputo protocol on the involvement of women in economic activities. We saw the Abuja protocol on the deployment of our resources in the health sector. We saw the Kigali protocol on one African passport and many other initiatives. I am of the view that those who want to deal with Africa and Africa herself must begin to recognize that if she is going to survive, she can only survive if her activities are continentally guided and continentally choreographed. And we are not naive when we talk about a continental approach. We know that Africa is heterogeneous. We know that the problems are nuanced, but knowing that is in itself an advantage because it helps us to differentiate what we need and what we prioritize regionally and by country. Look, for example, if we look at foreign policy as something that is designed or ought to be designed to inform the economy, how do we relate with Europe and America? How do we relate with Asia when we define our foreign policy? What are the instructions that we should give to our ambassadors when they are credited to a particular country in specific areas? Let us take the area of health, for example, because COVID is with us now. What would be the instruction? What would be the African foreign policy as regards health and as regards the vaccines? I was saying a few days ago that Africa remains the only continent that is still begging vaccines. if it does not beg Moderna from the United States or Johnson & Johnson, it is begging Sputnik from Russia. And if it is not begging Sputnik from Russia, it is begging Sinopharm from China. And if it is not begging Sinopharm, it is begging Pfizer. And if it is not begging Pfizer, it is begging AstraZeneca. And if it is not begging AstraZeneca, it will soon be begging Abdallah from Cuba. We cannot afford that luxury. We have, in my view, the intellectual firepower resident within the continent of Africa and resident within Africans in the diaspora, which is, if properly coordinated and deployed, would define how we deal with the rest of the world. And that is something that must be specific. It must be coordinated. I'm aware that we have the African Center for Disease Control, and it has now been devolved, and they are now present in all the 5 regions of the world. This is urgent business. That, in my view, is new medical foreign policy with clear instructions. If you go into the economic agenda, I see the International Monetary Fund and the Bretton Woods Institution have come back with in their full splendor to the continent of Africa, because many countries suffered as a result of COVID-19, and the economies have effectively contracted. And when the economies have contracted, it means job opportunities are lost. It means our young men and women are no longer able to realize their potential. That has an implication on security. That has an implication on agriculture and other areas. How are we going to deal with the presence of the IMF? As long as we are weak, the IMF will come to Kenya, the IMF will come to Tanzania, the IMF will come to South Africa, and they'll dictate what they think is in the best interest of those countries. And one of the problems with the IMF is that it has this jaundiced view that all the problems of Africa have a single solution. It is informed, either it is deliberate or it is diabolical, that African countries must be dictated to. And because the countries themselves are weak and desperate, they swallow the bait, line, hook, and sinker. And ultimately, generations then have to pay. I'm saying that in dealing with this issue, it can only be a continental approach. It can only be an approach that is informed by the key interest of the continent of Africa, so that it is not just governments that are involved in this regard, because many African governments also tend to be very short-term and myopic in their understanding of the needs of their people. Think tanks within the continent of Africa, the academy within the continent of Africa, the private sector within the continent of Africa must begin to play a critical role in defining how we interact with the Bretton Woods institution. The third thing is in the arena of the increasing military presence in Africa, which then makes Africa a legitimate target and a pawn in the political chessboard. Today, we see a rising China, a resurgent Russia, a Europe that is sulking out of our lost power, a hegemon in the United States of America, whose hegemony is being threatened by rising China, and India that is also trying to emerge. And as I said a little earlier, you only have to see this power play happening in Djibouti or in Ghana and other parts, and even in the heart of Africa. As I said, the Russians are now in the Central African Republic, and we know that they are trying to build a military base in Port Sudan. And we also know the increasing activities of the French in the Sahelian region. All these factors conjoined, if they are not arrested very early on, the continued military presence of these particular countries that I've mentioned in the continent of Africa serves to weaken Africa further. And you know, when you are weakened in that regard, you will discover that you are pawn and you will be manipulated. You know, it pains me times without number when I see there is a meeting of the G7. And what the G7 normally does is to invite one or two African countries. I do not know the criteria that they use, but occasionally they invite the president of South Africa, possibly because it's a large country, a large economy. They invite the president of Nigeria because it has a large population, and they'll invite the president of Egypt. And then they are paraded there for a photo opportunity. And after that, they are dismissed, I think. And even if they are dismissed, they play the gooseberry. They do not participate in the discussions that are defining. And that tells you that Africa does not matter. The same thing happens when there is a G20 meeting. They, of course, invite, from a tokenist standpoint, a number of African countries. And then they have a photo opportunity. And when they go to the UN Assembly, Africa is not present at the Security Council. In other words, all the African countries can vote all they want on a particular issue, but that the African vote, 1.5 million people's votes, can be neutralized by the veto power of France. When you live in a world such as that, it tells you that in matters of foreign policy, you are Lilliputian, whose contribution can't be poo-pooed, and indeed it is always poo-pooed. These are issues that cannot be ignored if Africa is to realize our potential. And I'm suggesting, therefore, going forward, that Africa has a duty to redefine how she relates with the world. And I'm not suggesting for one moment that it's the duty of the United States of America to organize us. I'm not suggesting for a moment that it's the duty of China or Russia or the European Union to organize us. I'm suggesting that it is our duty as Africans to come to this realization. I was saying at a different forum that since the British left the European Union, I've seen a more energized Britain trying to reconquer her lost colonies by dividing us and entering into bilateral arrangements with us, giving us a pittance. Africa must now redefine her foreign policy and refuse to be manipulated. This is not going to be for the faint-hearted. And as I conclude, I believe it is only in this sense that I understand Africa Agenda 2063. It is only in this sense that I understand the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. And I hope that the regional bodies are going to realize that they are only as useful to the continent of Africa as they understand themselves to be building blocks. ECOWAS had a meeting 2 months or 3 months ago, and I heard that statement coming out. East African Community also has had a meeting, a virtual meeting in the last 4 months, and I heard that coming out. SADC will have a meeting from the 14th to the 19th days of August, which is a month away, slightly under a month away. I hope that will be restated so that Africa can then, from regional blocks, move to Addis Ababa and say Africa Agenda 2063 can only be realized if we speak with one voice, however nuanced. That can only be realized if we redefine our foreign policy to mean that foreign policy only has sense when it has a fundamental agenda as the economic agenda. And I'm using the word economic agenda to include all the things that affect the quality of human life. Africa can't do it. Africa must do it, because Africa must realize, as I said a little earlier, and I repeat ad nauseum, the world is still governed by the law of the jungle. survival of the fittest and the dying of the least suitable. And if Africa does not recognize that, then Africa will not realize their potential. But we will not allow that to happen. I believe this is an intergenerational agenda. And you friends of goodwill who are resident here in Cincinnati and elsewhere, it is our joy that you are equally concerned and you recognize that going forward, there must be some kind of positive interaction in order to ensure that you collaborate with Africa. A united, coordinated Africa will be a useful player in the arena of the economy, in the arena of politics, and indeed in all other spheres of life which underpin human civilization. Thank you very much for granting me the opportunity to share my thoughts on this subject. God bless you.
Thank you, Mr. Lumumba. That was very enlightening, and many topics have been touched upon. Let me just raise one question, which may be many questions within one question. You mentioned a number of times the African Continental Free Trade Area, which was just launched January 1, 2021. 54 of the 55 African countries have signed on to this. Some 34, 35, I think, have ratified it, at least by the information that I have. And this agreement aims to remove tariffs on about 90% of the products over the next 5 years. What are the implications of this? I mean, this seems to be the newest initiative, which is an attempt to realize the very things that you've been speaking about, of Africa being able to react both internally to each other, but externally as a unified body. What are the implications of the ACFTA for trade with the U.S.? What are the implications of the ACFTA for its relationship and changing its relationships with China and the Bretton Woods institutions? How do you see that playing out? And what is the importance of that for the unification of Africa internally by looking at those relationships externally?
Thank you very much for that question. Number one, I think the primary justification for Africa Continental Free Trade Area is to ensure that intra-African trade is enhanced. And this is informed by the realization that one of the reasons that has stood in the way of intra-African trade is the existence of tariff and non-tariff barriers. And that if you eliminate all these tariff and non-tariff barriers, then the cost of goods will be reduced. And if you reduce the cost of goods, then a number of things are going to happen from an economic standpoint. The issue of consumption will be thus enhanced, and it will also incentivize African countries to trade with themselves or amongst themselves. I'll give a small example. Look at corn or maize, which a number of African countries import from Brazil or from Mexico, or sugar, which a number of countries also import from Brazil and Mexico. And yet, this happens in an environment where sometimes you have glut of the same product within the continent of Africa. I remember a time when Kenya was importing corn or maize from Brazil, and there was a glut in Tanzania and a glut in Malawi. So if you do that and you enhance intra-African trade, it is going to do a number of things. First of all, employment opportunities will be created, and of course, value addition, so that Africa does not export primary products where there is no value addition and get the worst prices in the world market. That, I think, is the primary thing. So that we move from a situation where intra-African trade is 20% and move it within the next 10 years to say something in the neighborhood of 50 and 60%. And I think that removing that dependency is also going to strengthen the arms, if you may, speaking metaphorically, of many African countries. The question would also, of course, arise: how does that then impact the balance of trade between Africa and the rest of the world. If you look at the United States of America, I believe that a stronger Africa, which is in the business of manufacturing goods where there is value addition, is going to be a better trade partner with the United States of America so that there is no dumping of goods. I'll give you a single product. This is used clothes. The East African community took the view that one of the things that had happened in East Africa and indeed in the continent was that the textile industries in Africa and in East Africa had died because Europe and America would dump the clothes that they had used within the continent. And during the Trump administration, one of the things that they did was to then manipulate Kenya, which then walked away of an East African arrangement that we would no longer be recipients of this particular product. And I think that if the United States of America were to trade with an Africa that is united, it would be easier to get goods into the continent of Africa without having these bilateral arrangements. Because if we determine, for example, what are the rules of origin, and we determine that in order for a particular product to be deemed to be an African good, this is the litmus test that it must satisfy, then it matters not whether those goods are from the goods and services are from the United States, whether they land in Dhaka in Senegal or in Nairobi in Kenya. And in that way, I think a number of things will happen. Number one, I think there'll be greater efficiency in the manner in which we relate. And number two, I believe there'll be better value addition. And for the benefit of Africa, I think the trade balance will also be rebalanced in a manner that is mutually beneficial. And that, I think, is critical. And the other area, before I mention that other area, is to mention China. China has a very predatory economic agenda. Not that Europe and America have not been predators. They have been. But China's model is a little bit more rapacious, in the sense that China is a juggernaut in the room with great appetite for natural resources. And what he's doing, particularly when he's relating with African countries, where the political leaders have a very short-term view of things, is that it is entering into the African market in the manner of a Trojan horse, with a view to taking over African institutions. Yet I believe that if we strengthen the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, African economy will be big enough to resist this juggernaut that is coming in the nature of China. And that is also true when you talk about a resurgent Europe and a resurgent United Kingdom. And all these things are also going to ensure that in the arena of technology, because if we insist on value addition, then we are going to improve the quality of our products, and African products are going to then find themselves into the Chinese market and hopefully into the American market. Look at a product like this, cocoa. La Côte d'Ivoire, Ghana, Togo are the biggest producers of cocoa. But if you look at the country that earns the most, it is Switzerland. It is Belgium, because there is no value addition. And because they have monopolized the market, and the rules that are deployed to the African continent under the WTO rules are also inimical to the interest of Africa. So in a nutshell, I am of the view that an approach that empowers Africa economically is an approach that will strengthen Africa and also do one very important thing, which is what I want to conclude my answer with. Because when Africa becomes a land of opportunity, the kind of thing that we see happening in Africa, where young men and women think that they must go to Europe and America as a way of economic liberation, will be curtailed, and people will then remain in their spheres of activity. And when they travel because it is necessary to do so and is economically justifiable to do so. Those are the things that come into my mind and into play when I respond to your question. Of course, typically, an answer such as that does not quite satisfy all the issues, but what it does is to flag out the critical areas so that you yourself can wrap your mind around those things and in their nuanced form, be able to inform your foreign policy agenda as you deal with the continent.
Since we're already actually over time, let me finish with this question. The thing that's been on all of our minds for the last year plus has been COVID, and the way in which a pre-COVID world and a post-COVID world may be different worlds. U.S. is in its own transitional period. Europe is in its transitional period. Asia, it is. Africa as well. We get so little information from Africa about what is actually going on with COVID. Can you give us any insights about what is going on beyond what you've already mentioned of Africa having to beg for the vaccinations? But what, as you look at that, what do you think are the implications of COVID for Africa in the short term, medium term, and possibly even long term? And I mean, just leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think the impact of COVID has been devastating. In the short term, what we have seen is that economies have contracted. We have seen that job opportunities have been lost. And the net effect of that is that Africa has the youngest population on earth. And you can begin to imagine what that means if you have young men and women for whom opportunities have been lost. So in the short to medium term, we'll see an Africa whose economy will be beaten and is already beaten. Beyond the statistics, I don't think there is a single African country whose economy has not contracted. And of course, in the medium term, what one sees is that in matters of human development, you see that mortality rates have been affected, the burden on the health system. This indeed has been the soft underbelly of many African countries because it exposed that very badly. You remember I think it was in the year 2001, under the Abuja Protocol, African governments said that they would deploy no less than 12% of their annual budget in the health sector. Of course, that did not happen. It's only Rwanda and Botswana that achieved that. And what has happened, therefore, is that bigger budgets are now going into the health sector. And when that is happening, it means that money that would be meant for other areas of development, in education, in agriculture, and other areas, are now being used to target this particular area. And already, as I speak to you now, it is projected that we are going to have food shortages, and nearly 200 million Africans are going to need food aid. That, I think, is also something that ought to be taken into account. But in the long term, I think it is going to do a number of things. The way in which we deal with issues, particularly in terms of technology, the uptake of technology in all areas is going to be something that we are going to embrace. And my own hope is that African countries are now will begin to realize that technology must be deployed in critical areas of the economy, whether it's in education, whether it's in agriculture, whether it's in the health sector, and that economies must also be designed in such a manner that they are resilient to these pandemics. In the early days, when the effect of COVID-19 was not as heavy as it was in Africa, as it was in Europe and America, we used to say that Africa had been prepared in a certain way because Africa dealt with Ebola, Africa dealt with malaria, but the Delta variant is now beginning to tell us that we did not enjoy the kind of immunity that we thought we would. So in the long term, I believe, and fortune favors the vigilant, I believe that many African countries are now beginning to embrace technology, so that if there is anything that we ought to use in order to reboot our economies is to ensure that we earned the dividends of the fourth industrial revolution as a means of deploying technology to cover all critical areas of our economy. And lastly, it is also going to ensure that African countries collaborate. We now recognize that if you stand alone, then you will fall. And I hope that this is indeed the wake-up call to African countries to collaborate a lot more in matters economics, in matters health, in matters agriculture. So that is my take, knowing as I do that time is not our ally this afternoon.
Well, let me thank you, Mr. Lumumba, for taking time from, I know it's a very busy schedule here in Cincinnati, to share your insights with the Foreign Policy Leadership Council. Let me also thank Prince Ellis and the African Professional Network for working with us on this. For those who are interested in the work of the Foreign Policy Leadership Council, please visit our website. We have a very good agenda coming up in the fall, so stay tuned for that. For those who are interested in what is going on in Africa, please be in touch with the African Professional Network. It is our best organization regionally who's doing this work, and they will keep you informed. So without further ado, I thank everybody, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you very much.